All right, now in this lecture, let's talk about validity. Okay, so what is validity? And now, as we said before in the reliability lecture, that validity is basically the veracity, how truthful it is. Okay, now, so as we said before, reliability is a prerequisite for validity. All right, so now imagine if there is a scale and then every time I step on it says 150. Okay, well, in reality, I weigh 150. So then every time I step on it says 150. So this measurement is not only reliable, but is also valid. Okay, but in the event that every time I step on it says 100 pounds, then well, that's not very um, while it's giving me the same number every time it tells me 100 pounds, 100 pounds, 100 pounds, but I don't weigh 100 pounds, right? So therefore it's reliable, but it's not valid. Okay, so validity is really the veracity of the actual measurement that you're trying to look. And on experiment sense, it is regarding the type of the findings, the finding of the experiment with the study is a really reflecting what it is, what the phenomenon of interest you're trying to describe. Okay, now there are several types of validity for the purpose of this course. There's construct validity, there's internal validity, and there's external validity. We're going to go through each and every one of them today. Now, validity is really a cumulative issue. Okay, so on the bottom, you really want to say if there is a relationship between the cause and effect. That's the conclusion, okay? And then internal validity, basically you're asking is the relationship causal. Construct validity is, well, can we generalize the constructs? All right, so in other words, are you measuring what you're claiming to measure? Okay, and external validity is how can we generalize that to other persons, places, and times. Okay, so these are all the accumulative aspect when it comes to the validity question. Now, let's first take a look at construct validity. Now, before we do that, we need to take a look at what is a construct? Well, a construct is an essence that we cannot measure directly. It is very crucial to characterize people with such construct. Okay, so the example of a construct would be intelligence, love, motivation, happiness. So these are the psychological processes that we as psychologists, we trying to study, but we cannot measure it directly. Okay, so there is no such thing as a meter in which you can just point at the person and just give you exactly the reading of how much love you feel for your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your mother or father, so there's no such thing. And so there is only indirect measurement of that. So this is why you see things like surveys, okay, self-report, these kind of stuff, okay? Now, when it comes to a construct, you can never prove or disprove a construct. Okay, and so therefore, you can only report or refute your results. Okay, now this is something that I want to say, and that is later on in your lab reports in the discussion section, there is going to be a part that is basically it wants you to summarize your results. Okay, now students love to use the word we prove that this is the case. Well, you should never write that in psychology. Okay, now you can do that in hardcore sciences like physics or chemistry, or biology even. But in psychology, because we are tapping into a construct, therefore it's not the right choice of words to use the word uh, proof or disprove something. Okay, so therefore you can only say things like our data or our results are consistent with the hypothesis that blah 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 and so forth. Or you can say that our results support the hypothesis that this whatever things. Okay, so you should make a mental note right now that you can never prove or disprove your construct. Okay, you can only say that it's consistent with the hypothesis, or it's or you can say that this is in support of the hypothesis. Okay, that's it. Okay, and then this is just basically tells you that you should never use the word proof or disprove. Okay, now let's take a look at construct validity now that we have defined construct. Okay, so construct validity is the degrees to which your operational definition reflects what your study aims to measure. Now, this is the key word, operational definition. Okay, now when your operational definition is well defined and well thought out, then your study most likely will have a high construct validity, and vice versa. If your operational definition is very poor, then your construct validity is also going to be pretty poor. Okay, now let's talk about what are some of the techniques for assessing construct validity. All right, so these are the 5 methods of that. So there is developmental changes, there's correlation with other methods, there's known groups technique, there's factor analysis, and number 5, there's internal consistency. Okay, now how do we, so let's talk about the first one. So developmental changes. Now, how do we actually look at what developmental change is? Well, this is basic, so this is based on the logic that when a person is developing, what a baby is developing, the baby goes from knowing almost nothing to gaining more interaction with the environment, and from there they gain the perception of the world, and then therefore they gain better cognition over time when a baby is turning into a small child, turning into a middle child, turning into a larger child, and their level of cognition also increase as the age increases. All right, so the example that I give you here is on intelligence tests, we should see the difference on the performance of the 3-year-old, 6-year-old, and 9-year-old. Okay, so, and this is basically on the logic that a 3-year-old should know better than than when they were 3 years old. All right, so 9 years old, they should know better than when when they were 3 years old. That's what I mean. Sorry. Okay. Now, if we don't see such a correlation, okay, then it should refute the construct validity. So imagine if you have a test that you're developing and you say that I'm going to say that this is an intelligence test, and you gave to a 3-year-old, and then he scores, let's say, 50 points, okay, and then you wait 6 years old and you give it to exactly the same child, and then you say, okay, do this test again, and then at 9 year old, after 6 years later, he got exactly the same score, 50, okay. I mean, it's most likely you're not testing some aspect of intelligence, because their intelligence from 3 years old to 9 years old is supposed to increase. Okay, so that is basically how you can use developmental changes as a way to measure the construct validity. Okay, now second one is you can correlate with other measures. So this is the concept of 2 aspects of the validity. This is the convergence validity and there's the discriminant validity. Okay, now convergent validity is basically aspect of validity showing that your measure correlate highly with previously established measures in which you intend to measure the same construct. So let's say if you are developing a test to measure intelligence, then it should correlate highly with like the Stanford Binet, which is like an intelligence test, or other well-established intelligence such as the WAIS or the WISC. So these are the aspect of the validity if your measurement is aimed to measure exactly the same thing, the same construct as the other previously well-established measurements, then the data that is derived on your test should be similar from the data that is derived from other people. So in other words, let's say if your newly developed test is aimed to measure intelligence, right? Then if you give it to a smart person who is, let's say, a genius, by the standard of the the Stanford Binet intelligence test, then they should do really, really well on they should do really, really well on your newly developed test, and vice versa. If you give it to a person who is unfortunately not so intelligent by the standard of the Stanford Binet intelligence test, and then your newly developed IQ test should all they should do pretty poorly on that. Okay, so you can see this is how convergent validity works. The data that's derived from your newly developed test should correlate very well with previously established measurements. And so that's convergent validity. Now, what is discriminant validity? So this is validity demonstrated by showing that your measurement does not correlate highly with other measure that is intended to measure other construct. So let's say if you develop a intelligence test, and then then the results should not correlate well with other things such as creativity or communication skills or musical talents. And now, regardless, you can kind of argue that, well, creativity and communication skills or musical talents, aren't they part of the intelligence? Well, they may be, but you'll see that they are not the whole intelligence test. They're not part of the entire intelligence. They're the only aspect of the intelligence test. So you can see that um, the discriminant validity should correlate poorly with other measurements. Okay. Okay, number three. So known groups technique. So this is something very similar to the convergent and discriminant validity strategy. But instead of you correlating with other previously known measurements, you are correlating with groups that are known to differ on characteristics on the measurement of that characteristic. Okay. So the example I give you is that if you intend to develop an instrument to measure musical talent, okay, students from Juilliard, they should do much better than students from Harvard. Okay, so likewise, if you intend to develop an instrument to measure general knowledge in history, then professors in the history department, they should score considerably better than professors in the psychology department. Okay, so this is basically use the groups that has a certain characteristics, and then you can then use your test on these people against other groups of people to see that if you see a disparity of score, and if you do, you should see two clusters. Okay, the known groups techniques do really well, while the groups that are not known for this characteristic, they are going to do poorly. Okay. Now the fourth method is factor analysis. So this is a way of crunching data, basically. So what you do is you get a bunch of variables and you see how they intercorrelate with each other. Okay, now the variables that correlate well together are most likely tapping into the same construct than variables that do not correlate well. Okay, so the example here, I give you 8 variables. Okay, so you got vocabulary level, you got spatial organization, you got sentence completion, you got mental processing speed, and then you got openness to experience, you got extroversion, you got agreeableness, and you got neuroticism. Okay, now when you do intercorrelation of each one of these facets, then what do you see? Okay, so what we see is, so let me kind of tell you how to read this. All right, so here on the top, you get each one of them in the row, okay, and down here you get on the left here you got each one of them in a column, okay, and then so basically what this is doing is kind of telling you how they in how each one kind of intercorrelate with one another. Okay, now so vocabulary and vocabulary is obviously going to correlate, have a perfect correlation. Okay, and then the spatial and spatial reasoning is going to have perfect correlation and so forth. Okay, now so let's discard that. Now let's just look at the part that is red. Okay, so vocabulary and spatial reasoning is correlate pretty well. So you see that the asterisk that's next to it, it just says that it's significant. Okay, and you can see that sentence completion. So all of these red part, you can see that this is formed in a cluster. Okay, now vocabulary and openness does not correlate very well. Okay, and vocabulary and extroversion does not correlate with each other very well. Vocabulary and agreeableness or the neuroticism, they do not correlate very well with one another, and so do the rest of the clusters. Okay, you can see that this blue is basically saying that this is not a significant correlation. Okay, now when we look at the later four, the openness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, these are correlating with each other pretty well. Again, you see kind of very similar to vocab, spatial, sentence completion, and mental speed. All right, so what does this mean? All right, so you can see that this is forming another subcluster here. So what this means is that the four first facets is most likely tapping into a same construct. Okay, and then while the later four, the openness, extroversion, blah blah blah, okay, that is most likely tapping into another construct. Okay, now if you took some sort of psychological testing class, you will know that the first four aspect of this is the aspect of a IQ test. Okay, so all four of these are subdomains of intelligence quotient. Okay, whereas the later four, the openness, extroversion, these are subdivisions or the components of personality. Okay, so therefore they are tapping into not exactly the same construct, but they're tapping into a similar construct. And together with openness, extroversion, agreeableness, the neuroticism, these collectively can explain under one domain of a bigger construct of personality. Okay, now fifth one is internal consistency. Okay, now internal consistency is more similar to if you are dealing with multiple items in the test. Okay, so let's say if you have two instruments, okay, and let's say both of them are some sort of clinical scale. All right, now instrument one, what you have is an item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then when you look at a person's data, what they're giving is something very similar in score. Okay, so 9, 10, 10, 9, 9. Okay, as opposed to instrument two, well, instrument two, you can see that, let's say exactly the same person, but different items, and then they're entering these items, and you can see that the score that they're getting, they're all over the place. Okay, it ranges from middle of the road like 5 to like the extremes like in 1 and 9. Okay, so and then what does this mean? Well, this means that instrument one is more likely to be more valid than instrument two. Okay. Okay, so internal consistency, I want to say, is internal consistency is one thing that is a little bit more an exception. That when you look at something that is highly internal consistent, this is not only the indicator that this is a highly valid study, but it's also highly reliable, because we said before that highly reliable stuff is a prerequisite for something that is valid, and therefore something that's highly valid is absolutely highly reliable as well, but not other way around. Okay. So anyway, internal when you see something that has high internal consistency, when you see the data are kind of tightly correlated like this, okay, then this is indicator that your instrument one is most likely more valid than instrument two. Now, content validity. So this is a psychometrics term. Okay, so if you've taken psychometrics, you know what this is. So this is referring to whether or not a test has the appropriate content. Okay, so content validity is really kind of like a part of a subdomain of the construct validity. But now just because a test has high construct validity doesn't really mean that it has high content validity. So the classic example is that if I tell you the midterm will be on chapters 1 to 7 and I test you on chapters 9 to 13, well, this will have very low content validity, even though the construct validity of the test still stands because it's still in the realm of experimental psychology. Okay. Now I promise I won't do that. I'm only gonna test you on the midterm on the stuff that we have covered so far in the first whatever weeks that we have done. Now let's talk about face validity. Okay. Now face validity is not real validity. Okay. So it is the extent to a person kind of the study kind of looks valid to a ordinary, a layman, okay, if you will. And so, however, even though face validity is not real validity, it's a very good place to start looking at the construct validity. Okay, this is just something I want to throw in there. Just remember, face validity is not real validity. Okay, so we have covered the construct validity aspect of it. Now let's talk about the internal validity. Okay. Now we're going to spend the entire class on internal validity in the later half of the course because there are a lot of aspects when it comes to the internal validity. But I just want to briefly mention what it is. Okay, so internal validity is making sure that it's only your manipulation in the independent variable, and only that manipulation alone is responsible for the differences in the group mean with the frequencies observed. Okay. Now, when the study is free of confounds or extraneous variables, it is internally valid. So what's a confound? So confound and extraneous variable are essentially alternative explanations that you can find that says, okay, I don't think the differences that we are seeing between the control group and the experimental group is due to the manipulation. I think it's due to something else. Okay, so alternative explanations, if you can come up with that, that would be a confound. Okay, so when someone says that this can confound the study, that means that they're questioning your internal validity. They're essentially questioning whether or not it is really the manipulation that is responsible, that your intended independent variable that is responsible for the differences in the statistical significance that you're seeing. Okay, now let's talk about the last one. That would be the external validity. Well, external validity, if I want to sum it up in one word, and that would be generalizability. Okay, can our study, can they be generalized to other people, other times, other settings, other environments, or other places? Okay, now the further away it departures from your original outcome, then the less amount of the external validity you have. Okay, so now imagine if you have a study and your population of interest is all college students in United States, okay? And you decided to gather only Caucasian students to be part of your study. Well, that is not that when your study won't have very high external validity because the results of the study it will for sure apply to other Caucasian college students, but does it apply to, let's say, Asian students? Does it apply to African American students? Does it uh, does it apply to other races? It might not. Okay, so what you probably want to do is you want to include Caucasian students, African American students, Asian students, Hispanic students, all and Native American students, and you as many as you can. Okay, so you want to diversify the people that are enrolled in your study. And after you have done this and chosen pretty carefully, there are methods how to do this. Okay, you can, so for instance, in you can look at the population distribution of the actual, let's say, American college. And so let's say I'm just making up numbers. So let's say if there are 55% of Caucasian students and 20% African American students, and so then your enrollment into your participation of your study should reflect exactly that proportion. Okay, so that's one way of dealing with that. Another way of dealing with that is, all right, now another way to deal with that is to basically, let's say you have five ethnicity backgrounds. You got Caucasian, Asian, African American, Hispanics, Native Americans, right? The main five. Okay, so and then what you can do is you can evenly distribute them, and then so each population, well, not population, each ethnicity gets a 20% quota into your experiment. Okay, then this is then you can see that this is well balanced out in terms of the study. Okay, so there are two ways of doing that. Okay, now let's take a look at this. Now your external validity also has to do with, can your results be generalized to other places? Okay, so what is true in New York, is that also true in Tokyo? Is it also true in Shanghai? Is it also true in Paris? Is it also true in Moscow? Is it also true in like Sydney? Okay, whatever that you want to say. And now this has not necessarily has to do with just the city itself, with the nation. It has to do also with different cultural backgrounds. Okay, and so the more that your studies is internally valid, then you can see that this is something if you found something that basically wherever you take it to anywhere in the world, that people are going to do it. People are going to respond it to the way that you found. So in other words, the findings of your experiment or your study is going to be resistant to cultural differences. Okay. Now let's take a look at times. Okay. Now imagine you in your 20s versus your grandparents in their 20s. Okay. We grew up in very different times. Okay. Right now, the youngsters such as you are born like MP4 ready. Okay, and you guys are born ready with all these Apple gadgets and stuff like that. Your grandparents have not, been exposed to. And it's just one very simple example. And so you'll see that the social norm, as well as a lot of the aspect of the personality, also evolves over time. Okay, in which that the way that the people communicate with each other, they use things like WhatsApp, they use things like Instagram, such thing did not exist back in the days, let's say 100 years ago. People wrote love letters to their loved ones, and now people, when you are just like, when you miss your boo, what do? You just hit the FaceTime with the Skype button, and then you can just video conference them, as if they are in the room with you. which is very good for long distance relationship and stuff like that. I sorry for that tangent, but you see that the times have evolved, okay, and that has a lot to do with just the fact that the human evolution is well progressing, right? And then you see that a lot of the time you can also think about something major that happens and then the lifestyle of people have also changed. So well, the best example that I can give you right now is something that we are all experiencing through, and that is the COVID-19. So you can think about your life pre COVID-19 and post COVID-19. Well, we're actually still in the middle of one, but then when you kind of think about it, then you can just kind of see that how much of the way that we socially interact with one another has changed so dramatically in just a couple of months, not even a year, right? So you can really appreciate that the times in a rapidly evolving time like this, especially, uh, it's really important to pay attention to the external validity to see that if something that you have found, the results that you have found, can this also be, is this eternally true, essentially? Okay, because it may be true now, but maybe 1,000 years from now on, when people that are communicating with God knows what, uh, is it true still? Would it still be true then? Well, we don't know. Okay, only time would tell. Okay. Okay, now here is basically, it sums up what I was saying before. So external validity is the generalizability to the real world. It can you generalize to all gender, race, time, zeitgeist, demographic, culture, nationality, social situations, age, etc., etc., etc. Okay, now so this has to do with diversity. So obviously the more diverse that you have, um, especially let's say your participants, the better your external validity will be. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is lab setting and external validity. Now you would, of course, you would think that, well, if you do a experiment, if you collect them that's outside of the lab, you are observing a person in their natural habitat, then of course the results that you would get is going to be much more externally valid compared to something that you some data that you collected in the laboratory settings. Okay, now these are the other concepts that you should know. So manipulation check, Hawthorne effect, placebo and placebo effect sensitivity, floor effect, and ceiling effect. All right, so manipulation check is an essential part of an successful experiment. So this is the questionnaire designed to figure out whether or not participants perceive the manipulation that the researchers found. So remember the Darley and Latine smoke under the door study? Okay, so uh, if the participants did not even notice that there is smoke that is coming out under the door, well, then they would not know how to respond, right? They would just think that nothing is going on and they're just going to keep writing on their, filling out the questionnaire form, right? So this is why manipulation check is very important. You want to ask the participants, did you notice that there were this is our intention to do the manipulation. And so having manipulation check will also help you to get cleaner data. Okay. Now, the Hawthorne effect. So this is the effect when the participants behave differently because they are being observed. So something very similar to reactivity, but Hawthorne effect also applies when the person is getting a special treatment. So they think they are getting uh, some sort of special treatment. So they not necessarily the actual intended treatment, but they just feel like, oh, I am like some sort of VIP, and because the experimenter is paying all this attention to me, and therefore they started to behave differently as they would be if they did not get all these special treatments. Okay. And there's also the placebo effect. So what is a placebo? Well, the placebo treatment is a fake treatment that does not have any real effect other than the power of suggestion or persuasion. Okay. So example of the placebo would be something like water pill. Okay, it's not supposed to have any effect, but the fact that you took something, you think that there's an effect, therefore your behavior and your perception of what is going on out there started to change. That is a very common placebo effect. But I have to say, even though it sounds like bogus, placebo effect is very real, and sometimes the placebo effect is even more so powerful than the actual real treatment. Okay, so you just want to make sure that the placebo effect that you are doing to yourself is something that is going to help you rather than hurt you. Okay, so this is why positive thinking really actually helps when it comes to boosting yourself up. Okay, now Hawthorne effect versus placebo effect. So there are some subtle differences. They both have to do with some sort of persuasion or some sort of mental suggestion. Okay, but the main difference is that the Hawthorne effect applies more to participants in normal population and treatments that aren't pills. Placebo uh, placebo is applies more to a pill treatment with a patient population. Okay, so that's the main differences. But essentially, they are both involving some sort of uh, mental persuasion or the power of suggestion that you are going to get better, you are going to get or worse, it could be better or worse. And it doesn't have to be always better. Of course, you in a psychological experiment and being a clinician myself, like I would want them to actually get better. So this is why I tend to use the word better. But research wise, it doesn't have to be on the direction of getting better. It can absolutely also be on the direction of getting worse as well. Okay, now what is sensitivity? Well, sensitivity is measurement of a study's ability to detect real differences between given variables. So sensitivity has a lot to do with the error. So when you reduce the error, you increase sensitivity and vice versa. Okay, this is very similar to power. So when you kind of think about power, so this is basic ability to detect differences as well. But power is more a statistical term, whereas the sensitivity is the way that the way that you basically set up the experiment, the way you design the experiments. Okay, so sensitivity is an experimental term, whereas the power is a statistical term. Okay. All right, ceiling effect. Something ceiling effect is something of a measurement problem. So now, so just imagine that if you are using a body thermometer to test the temperature of a boiling water, well, what is that thermometer gonna say? It's gonna say 40 degrees Celsius because that's as high as it goes, but is the water really 40 degrees Celsius? No, it's not. Okay, so this is a measurement problem. If you are picking the correct thermometer, you will see that this boiling water is 100 degrees Celsius, not 40 degrees Celsius. Okay, so you see that the ceiling effect is basically when the test is too easy when it comes to the performance, okay, something like that. Okay, so another example I gave you is I wanted to test how good you guys are with math. So I give you elementary school's math test. Everybody gets 100% correct, and I don't know who is better in math than who. Okay, so this is a problem with the ceiling effect. Okay, now the floor effect is exactly the same problem, but on the opposite end of the stick. Okay, so like the ceiling effect is also a measurement problem. It's when the dependent variable is not sensitive to detect below a certain level. Okay, so the example that I gave you is I gave the first grade elementary school kids the calculus exam and tell them to do as well as they can on that thing. and or the score range all came back at 0 because they they haven't learned calculus, right? And then I don't know which first grade kid is smarter than whom. Okay, so that's the floor effect for you essentially. Okay. Now, there are some exceptions when the floor with the ceiling effect is not a problem. And what is that? Well, it comes to the screening test. Okay, so let's say if a test is which is designed to screen for, let's say, psychopathologies, should have a ceiling or floor effect if you are testing on the general public. So let's say if uh, you are a psychologist for the army, then of course that they don't want people who are depressed to be in the army because you're going to be very far away and then you might be more prone to post-traumatic stress disorders and things like that. So they're going to have you as an army psychologist to test these soldiers before you dispatch them to like the front line, right? And then so then ideally every person that comes in should just ace the exam, right? Now, if you see a person who is not acing, and that is a major problem, saying which kind of suggests that he or she may have some underlying issues, and that he or she might be more susceptible to other stressful stimuli that when you go out to get dispatched to overseas to the front line, that they may succumb to mental pressure and also the loneliness that's going out there uh, in the front line. So this is something that you need to kind of think about. All right, so this is when a ceiling or floor effect is not a problem. Okay, another example is the qualifying exam. So okay, so if on the exam that is designed to make sure that you achieve a certain level of proficiency, so such as your CUNY proficiency exam. Now this is just a review from your statistics. Okay, so the floor effect is associated with which skew. Okay, so so if you remember, the skew is where the tail is, right? So the positive skew would mean that the tail is on the right end, right? So that means that this is associated with the floor effect. While the negative skew, the tail is on the left end, that is going to be associated with uh, the ceiling effect. Okay? Okay, so we are done with this lecture, and then just kind of look out for some, so there are going to be more discussion, and then so just definitely make sure that you participate in these discussion on the threads. Okay, thank you.